Show. Okay. Three. Well, we are late. Well, good morning. My name is Paulo Sotero. I am the director at the Brazil Institute here at the Wilson Center. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all this morning to this conversation on the rule of law in Brazil, 3 decades of progress and challenges. There are more people coming that will join us soon. We have also friends and people interested in the topic watching the proceedings from São Paulo, from Rio, and from other places because we are webcasting live the morning session. I wanted to start by thanking very much the speakers that accepted our invitation to engage in this very, very important conversation here in Washington. We developed this seminar, this conference, as part of a effort by the Wilson Center on rule of law. We are with my colleague Will Pomerantz from the Kennan Institute, who is present here. We are mapping out a series of events like this because we think that the rule of law has emerged as a cross-cutting theme, very important for an institution like the Wilson Center. We pretend to be a place that improves the quality of public policies through research, to debates, through conversations like this one. The Wilson Center, as you may know, is the national memorial to the 28th President of the United States. I always like to remind people, especially those from Rio, that Avenida Presidente Wilson in Rio de Janeiro, that is the president. And that actually it crosses Avenida Rio Branco. I think it's a very important because those are two people of the same age and with the same mind frame about the world. Why we did this? Because this comes from an effort, a joint effort, is in part due to a dear friend that today ends his residence here with us as a fellow, Matthew Taylor. He has been with us here since the beginning of this year. And he thinks that he's leaving, but I will not allow him to be far away because we are going to continue to go after him. His neighbor here at American University. But I have him to thank to help us map this out. And the reason of this session is summarized in the flyer that we distribute with the invitation. It was drafted by Michael. It's basically with all the challenges we have in Brazil today, we have to recognize that we are in the middle of struggle for building democracy in a country. We have been at that for 3 decades. We continue to do that. The other day, I actually found it remarkable, a statement made by Minister Joaquim Levy, who spoke here on February 17th, after that enormous, massive street rally on the 15th of March this year that marked the 30th anniversary of the reinstatement of democracy. There was a major protest, and Joaquim Levy was asked about the protest and said, maybe state capitalism doesn't work very well in democracy. And my reaction to that is that since we are not going to give up democracy in Brazil, no way of that happening, we are going to have to review our brand of state capitalism and make it more efficient and maybe start a opening up that is necessary for Brazil to become a more competitive and a more and continue this rise based on the rise of its middle class in democracy. Here is what motivates us in a very positive way, and is that 3 decades of democratic rule in Brazil have produced meaningful progress towards establishing a universal and effective rule of the law in South America's largest nation. The formal institutions of the judicial system have been improved in significant ways through a series of reforms to the legal structure, changes in procedural rules, and improvements in staffing and administration. The courts have addressed rising citizens' demands by improving their efficiency, even as they simultaneously expanded access. The judicial system has narrowed the gap between demands for justice and provisions of rights, expanding the effective civil, political, and social rights available to citizens. And this is what the seminar is about. We are very glad to have some key experts on the topic, some actually builders of this progress with us this morning. I wanted to start, though, by recognizing a key supporter, friend, advisor to the Brazil Institute, Ambassador Luigi Einaudi, who has been with us from the beginning and is a dear friend, a counselor to us here, and actually a supporter through the San Giacomo charitable fund that he manages. I especially would like to recognize those invited guest speakers that came from far, starting with Minister Luis Inácio Adams. Thank you very much for being here. The Minister, you have everybody's bios here. I'm not going to read those, but I think Minister Adams represents, this new generation of people engaged in the exercise of the application of the law in Brazil, and that builds on work done by previous generations. And I'm very pleased and very proud to have with us Minister Nelson Jobim. Minister Nelson Jobim, when I talked about the builders of the democratic rule in Brazil, I was referring to him as a member of our Constituent Assembly in the 1980s, then as Minister of Justice, as Minister of the Supreme Court and President of that court. Minister Jobim has been absolutely instrumental in building this, creating this new, more favorable situation for the rule of law that we have today in Brazil. I want also to recognize Oscar Vilhena and Joaquim Falcão, the deans of 2 of the most important and influential law schools in Brazil, from Getúlio Vargas, São Paulo, Getúlio Vargas, Rio de Janeiro. Also, our dear friend and really a partner in many of the dialogues we have had over this issue, Judge Peter Massetti, federal judge in the state of Maryland, who was, after law school at Chicago Law School, went to Brazil as a Peace Corps volunteer and got addicted to us. So he never left. And we call him affectionately the Juiz de Fora, because he's often in Brazil. We do things together. We will continue. We have plans to continue this dialogue. I obviously would like also to thank very much our sponsors, Matos Filho Advogados and Arnold and Porter, represented here by, in the case of Matos Filho, Amadeu Ribeiro, who heads their office in New York, and Glaucia Frascino came from São Paulo, from Arnold and Porter, our dear friend Ellie Whitney Debevoise, Professor Maria Teresa Sadek, who has been accompanying, studying the changes in the judicial system in Brazil, especially after the creation of the National Council of Justice. Lynn Hammergren, who has studied the issue, Luciana Gross Cunha, who is a professor at GV Direito and has been with us from this beginning, planning this. I think I covered everybody, and I would like now to ask our dear ambassador, Luis Alberto Figueiredo Machado, recently arrived in Washington to be our ambassador here. Actually, I am kind of almost abusing his goodwill because this is the fourth time this week that we're doing something together. He was here in this stage the other day helping us open an exhibit on art and called Mist of the Earth, or Fumaça da Terra, from Brazilian artist Denise Milan. It's on the fourth and fifth floors here at the entrance, and the ambassador was kind enough to come here and help us open that exhibit, and a seminar that we had on art and sustainability that brought together experts on Denise's work, like Manuela Mena from the Prado Museum Prado in Spain. She is the curator of Goya and Velázquez, and Naomi Muniz, our dear professor emeritus from Georgetown, and also Tom Lovejoy, also a member of our advisory council here. So the ambassador has been very, very kind, and I would like to ask him again to, help us open this conversation, and that will continue throughout the day. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
Good morning. It is indeed a great pleasure and honor to be here and to see around me people that are so important in my country, in our contemporary life, as Minister Luiz Adams, Minister Nelson Jobim, two of the most outstanding legal minds that we have in our country. And I would like also to recognize and thank all those who made this event possible. First, the Wilson Center, Paulo, but certainly also Fundação Getúlio Vargas, the American University, and all those who sponsored it, for their help in putting together an event on something that is very dear to the hearts of Brazilians. The fact that this year we are commemorating 30 years of democracy, and it is extremely timely that we talk about this issue. In my mind, Brazilians should and are proud of what the country and its people have accomplished in the era of the rule of law since the redemocratization 30 years ago. In hindsight, it is clear that our democracy was not built from scratch in the aftermath of the military dictatorship in 1985. Actually, Brazil has always had a democratic culture that can be traced back to the early days of the independence, the fight for abolition, the old republic, and the period between the end of the Second World War and the military coup of 1964. Uh, and despite some ups and downs, the good seeds of democracy and freedom had been planted since our independence. And once you experience democracy and breathe the fresh air of liberty, you get addicted to them. We emerged from the military rule in 1985 with an acute conscience of the importance of the democratic rule of law as a foundation on which to build a more inclusive and just society. It is true that there remains challenges to be addressed, but we should never lose sight of the long-term trajectory, which in the Brazilian case has been outstandingly positive. It is undeniable that the institutions of the rule of law in place today are much more prepared to meet the challenges of our time and live up to society's demands than in the past. This is not trivial, nor it is obvious. There is no predetermined pathway from the establishment of a democratic system through elections to the effective enjoyment by all citizens of their rights. Deterministic theories do not stand the test of reality when it comes to democratic institutions. The law can be democratic in theory and can even establish a plethora of rights in writing, but that is far from being enough. As important as the legal framework is, it must be accompanied by mechanisms that have teeth, institutions that are empowered with the means to ensure the full exercise of such rights and the fulfillment of the lofty promises enshrined in our Constitution. To put it in a nutshell, the institutions in charge of the rule of law have to work properly and efficiently, or the legitimacy of the democratic building can be easily undermined. The electoral system must be fraud-proof, the courts must be independent and have the capability of upholding the rights of every individual is entitled to. There must be accountability and oversight mechanisms in place to ensure that wrongdoing by public officials will be duly investigated and punished. The adoption of the 1988 Constitution was a clear watershed in the strengthening of the rule of law in Brazil. The adoption of the Constitution, however, was followed by successive actions aimed at refining existing institutions and giving shape and substance to the ones that had just been sketched. Brazil had to bridge the gap between the ideals envisioned by our modern-day founding fathers and the raw reality of the institutional environment and the experience of its citizens. There is no doubt we have succeeded. Or better, we continue to succeed, since this is an ongoing and never-ending process of improvement. We are able to ensure, in essence, that the principle of separation of powers established by the Constitution was protected by an effective system of checks and balances. A system grounded not only in stronger institutions, but also in the empowerment of the citizenry to speak and assemble freely. the new constitution was followed by concrete steps that allowed for the enhanced role of an independent public prosecutor's office, the Ministério Público, which is rightly considered one of the cornerstones of the rule of law in Brazil. Since then, the federal police has been empowered to partner with public prosecutors and the judiciary in fighting crimes, including the most sophisticated kind of felonies that in the past used to go unpunished, like corruption and money laundering. Our accounting courts at local, state, and federal levels have also improved their performance over the years to the point of becoming beacons of sound public administration. The establishment of strong internal control and oversight mechanisms in the federal government and in many states was also an important step forward. The role of the General Controller of the Union and that of the ethics committees in different ministries and agencies are noteworthy in this regard. During the last 3 decades, our democracy was able to produce a faster and cheaper judiciary system and improve transparency and open access to information on government expenditures. Without trying to be exhaustive, I think these examples illustrate my point concerning the outstanding work that was done in Brazil in the last 30 years. The panels to be held today will certainly provide the opportunity to examine at length the huge progress Brazil has made, even if compared to some developed countries, as well as some challenges that we still face. If we are in a better position today to overcome whatever obstacle that presents itself, this is due mainly to the strength of our institutions and the deeply ingrained democratic values of our people. I wish you all a productive discussion and a fruitful dialogue on an issue, the strengthening of the rule of law, of critical importance and something that makes all Brazilians extremely proud. Thank you very much.
Well, I would like to invite Minister Adams, Dean Oscar Vilhena, Judge Peter Massetti, and Dr. Glaucia Fascino to join us here. While you do this, 2 things. You can speak either in Portuguese or in English. We have simultaneous translation. And I want to just give you one nice information about the Washington College of Law from American University, a co-sponsor, runs every year a competition. It's a mock court where law students present cases. And they are running it this week, and there are 2 finalists. And the 2 finalists are Brazilians. One from the Getúlio Vargas Law School in Rio de Janeiro, and the others are from PUC São Paulo. So they are at the American College of Law, Massachusetts Avenue, presenting, and this is a competition that has a good number of participants from around the hemisphere, so I wanted you to know that I think on the quality department, it remains very hopeful. The quality of Brazilian law students in Brazil and also the ones coming here. With that, I would like to offer the floor to our keynote speaker, Minister Luiz Inácio Adams, who comes from the south of Brazil, has been, as a lawyer, working for the federal government. Actually, I would say that he has helped over more than 20 years build the office that he now leads. Minister, the floor is yours.
I pretend to deliver a speech in Portuguese. There's no problem about it. Em primeiro lugar, gostaria de agradecer ao professor Paulo Sotero por essa convite, por essa oportunidade. Dizer que eu acredito que esse mundo que se conecta via sistemas digitais hoje torna uma aldeia global em que tantas culturas e tantas experiências transitam e se interagem de maneira extremamente positiva. E nisso acabamos também por aprender valores e reconhecer uns nos outros através desses valores que são também valores comuns. Como é o caso, especificamente, do respeito à lei, ao mandato da lei, da rule of law, nos países democráticos. Eu, só para informação, o tempo exato da... 15, ok. Well, ok, tá, eu ia botar aqui agora. Mas a lei tem 94 minutos, eu acho. Mas eu queria expressar aqui, tratar essa questão do rule of law, pontuando uma das suas dimensões, que eu acho que é a percepção de segurança jurídica. Respeitar ou submeter-se ao comando, à soberania da lei, nos atos da administração, nos atos particulares, é basicamente uma forma, uma referência cujo elemento central é exatamente essa percepção de estabilidade, essa percepção de segurança naquilo que cada pessoa, cada cidadão, cada empresa, cada agente tem ao se relacionar, ao agir dentro do Estado. E nesse ponto, a nossa Constituição Federal ela foi muito impositiva e muito clara, particularmente lá no artigo 5º, que está aqui traduzido, inciso 36, que é a proteção dos atos e dos direitos contra a lei. Nós chegamos ao nível, inclusive, e essa jurisprudência da Suprema Corte tem se afirmado, de estabelecer esse princípio também em relação ao chamado poder constituinte derivado, em que as emendas constitucionais aprovadas não podem interferir exatamente pelo princípio da cláusula pétrea que está previsto no nosso artigo 62, interferir nesta garantia fundamental. O nosso desafio em relação à observância e nessa dimensão da segurança jurídica do rule of law está, para meu ponto de vista, em 3 níveis. O primeiro nível tem associado a nossa, ou a dificuldade da formação legislativa. A qualidade legislativa, a qualidade das leis produzidas interferem nesse processo de percepção de segurança e, portanto, de observância da lei. Exatamente porque... só botar aqui para me controlar melhor aqui. Exatamente. Senão vou falar 95 minutos, aí não acho não. Exatamente porque a qualidade legislativa é um elemento que impõe pontos de, digamos assim, de divergência que permanecem. A lei, como um evento, um fato do direito, ele é essencialmente um produto da política. E como tal, como uma expressão da política, a própria lei, ela mantém na sua formalização, muitas vezes, as tensões naturais da própria debate político que a precedeu na sua formalização. Essa característica, ela é muito claramente visível nos debates que houver no Brasil, por exemplo, em relação ao Código Florestal, ao novo Código Florestal. O processo de formulação da lei, que acabou se vingando, foi um processo extremamente tensionado, complexo, em que houveram uma lei aprovada com decisões de veto a presidente, que geraram medida provisória, que por uma vez foram de novo submetidos a presidente, que novamente foram vetados e resultaram no final num decreto. Ou seja, foi um processo extremamente complexo, debatido, no debate, extremamente, digamos assim, litigioso pelas partes envolvidas, o movimento ambiental contra o setor ruralista, que levou a um processo legislativo que não se encerrou exatamente na edição da própria lei, mas que permanece numa fase subsequente, que é a sua implementação. E aqui entra o segundo ponto de cuidado na formulação do instrumento jurídico, que é a estabilidade jurisprudencial. É a formatação de uma jurisprudência que seja capaz de traduzir aquele impasse, aquelas tensões naturais da legislação dentro de um contexto de incorporação do sistema que seja estável, não seja submetido a mudanças erráticas e diferenciadas. E o último grande elemento de estabilidade, evidentemente, é o baixo nível de litigiosidade, está associado a um certo sentimento de justiça social, justiça econômica, que, em última análise, autoriza ou traz aos indivíduos a não necessidade de buscar litigar pelos seus direitos, né? Isso passa por um Estado que seja efetivamente prestador de serviços e, como tal, ele presta serviço adequadamente. Um dos grandes debates que nós travamos recorrentemente no Brasil, evidentemente, em outros lugares do mundo também deve acontecer, mas no Brasil nós temos isso porque nós adotamos por base constitucional como uma obrigação de Estado universal, é o direito à saúde, que é fonte constante de ações judiciais, exatamente porque a tensão natural entre o direito do indivíduo à sua prestação, a prestação do Estado garantir a sua saúde, inclusive nas chamadas tratamentos experimentais, buscando soluções alternativas no dilema do indivíduo em face da morte, versus o tratamento de toda uma comunidade, que são 200 milhões de habitantes, todos eles que devem ser cobertos, com base no princípio da regra constitucional, devem ser cobertos pela proteção do Estado nesse ponto. Então, essas tensões que geram essa percepção, essa litigiosidade, é um elemento essencial. Nesse caso particular, eu acho que o Brasil enfrenta um desafio especial, e eu vou falar um pouco mais sobre isso depois, em termos de alternativas que nós estamos trabalhando lá, mas é o alto grau de litigiosidade que nós vivemos hoje. Nós temos, pelas estimativas do Conselho Nacional de Justiça, algo em torno de 100 milhões de ações judiciais em curso, sendo que esse processo, ele como diz o sistema de juros, né? Ele tem viés de alta, né? Então, ele tem uma tendência à acumulação, exatamente porque o modelo que o Brasil adotou para resolver os conflitos, ele é essencialmente judicializável, né? Ele é um modelo que se baseia no juiz como agente de resolução do conflito e perde, pelo menos era assim que se enfrentava, perde digamos assim, na capacidade das partes de tomar essa deliberação diretamente. De qualquer maneira, o Brasil tem um sistema judicial, construiu, e a Constituição Federal garante isso tem se visto recorrentemente, um sistema judicial realmente independente que consegue exercer a sua seu mistério, a sua função, com autonomia em relação aos poderes e muitas vezes contrariando os poderes, né? Só para citar um exemplo imediato, a Suprema Corte julgou ontem, há 2 semanas foi adotada o que se convencionou chamar no Brasil de PEC da Bengala, né? Que na verdade foi uma extensão do tempo de compulsoriedade à aposentadoria dos juízes, dos servidores públicos, que era 70 anos, passou a 75, e o Supremo veio julgar isso 2 semanas depois, o tema que foi exatamente ontem, declarando um aspecto dessa lei como inconstitucional, que era a exigência que a emenda constitucional estabelecia de que os juízes, para permanecerem na função, deveriam passar por uma nova sabatina junto ao Congresso Nacional. E essa possibilidade, essa exigência foi considerada inconstitucional exatamente porque representava uma interferência indevida de um poder no outro, que está, evidentemente, vedada como cláusula pétrea. Então, é um caso de emenda constitucional que foi declarada parcialmente inconstitucional, com redução de texto, exatamente com essa característica. Mas o fato que o exemplo mostra exatamente o grau de independência e de cuidados, porque nessa mesma lei também o próprio Supremo tomou cuidado também de impedir que houvesse uma prorrogação de liminares de ação de decisões judiciais que estendesse a aposentadoria de outros juízes, porque isso não está previsto no texto constitucional, da emenda constitucional, e o Supremo veio a suprimir. Então, na verdade, isso aqui é um exemplo que mostra exatamente quanto isso é verdadeiro. O grande elemento que compõe, eu acho, esse constitucionalismo moderno, e acredito que o professor Carlos vai falar um pouco mais sobre isso, mas é o fato de que o Supremo Tribunal Federal ele vem em mutação a modelos de corte constitucional, ou avançando como uma corte constitucional, uma jurisprudência muito mais efetiva na implementação do próprio texto constitucional, ao contrário do que ocorria no passado no Brasil. E essa jurisprudência vem exatamente baseado nessas multiplicidades de garantias e direitos e proteções que a Constituição veio implementar em várias faixas, questão indígena, questão social, propriedade, direito à saúde, né? Questões relacionadas a questões tributárias, proteção a um sistema tributário que procure evitar a bitributação, procure evitar a surpresa no processo tributário. Esse modelo veio a ser estruturado com uma complexidade e, portanto, a Corte Constitucional tem assumido para si o papel central de dar coerência, de dar consistência, equilibrando, de um lado, o direito às possibilidades reais nessa sua implementação. Ao mesmo tempo, o Brasil, no processo de implementação constitucional, também veio a fazer várias reformas, né, e adotar várias legislações que apontam a esse processo de formatação e formalização e especialização das próprias instituições brasileiras, criando bases de responsabilidade, como é o caso da Lei de Responsabilidade Fiscal. E aqui, professor Sotero, uma coisa muito interessante para mostrar o grau de independência, mas também um grau de valorização. Esse tema, responsabilidade fiscal, é um tema que se tornou um debate político no processo eleitoral no passado. Ou seja, o tema em si ele se incorporou um valor para o debate político de maneira muito significativa no Brasil. E o fato de esse debate mostra o nível de necessidade, o nível de impossibilidade de recuo que a sociedade já estabeleceu em relação a diversos temas, e nesse caso em particular. E essa garantia é uma garantia que mostra que a democracia no Brasil realmente possui força, possui uma característica pujante, que é o envolvimento da sociedade como um todo. E nesse caso, o envolvimento, claro, em parte também porque o voto no Brasil é obrigatório. Portanto, todos os aptos a elegerem têm que ou justificar a não presença, porque estão fora do sua base eleitoral, ou ser obrigatório a sua votação, o que levou a uma presença maciça de votação e mostrou também, a partir da atuação do nosso Tribunal Superior Eleitoral, uma qualidade na afirmação da democracia, porque o resultado, inclusive no caso do ano passado, que foram os resultados mais apertados que já passaram na história do Brasil, em termos de eleição, para vocês terem uma ideia, Tribunal Eleitoral acabou só divulgando o resultado quando fosse terminada a última urna, que era no Acre, que ela fechava 2 horas depois do prazo original, que as outras duas fecharam. Então, nesse período, o processo de apuração foi muito ágil, que é todo eletrônico, e esse processo, quando o tribunal divulgou, já tinha mais de 90% das urnas apuradas. E o que é interessante que não aparecia, porque como não liberou a apuração antes, é que até 92% da apuração, o candidato Aécio Neves estava na frente da eleição. O processo reverteu nos finais 10%, quando começaram a entrar os estados mais distantes e mais atrasados em termos de apuração. Mas mostra que o resultado ele tinha uma disputa muito acirrada e muito próxima no resultado. E, apesar disso, apesar dessa disputa, o resultado é inquestionável. Né? O Tribunal Superior Eleitoral garantiu, como poder independente que é, a sua preocupação de garantir uma efetiva afirmação democrática. E essa inquestionabilidade se dá num processo de democracia que se afirma. Eu acho que o Brasil, nesse ponto, passa por diversas mudanças institucionais, aperfeiçoamentos institucionais. É da natureza da democracia que isso aconteça. E o fundamental é que o processo democrático em si é capaz de sustentar essas mudanças. Então, nós fizemos, por exemplo, em 2004, foi feita a instituição do Conselho Nacional de Justiça, né? Foi feita a reforma com a adoção das súmulas vinculantes, que é um prenúncio do ester decisis, não exatamente a mesma coisa, porque a vinculação aqui se dá na conclusão, não no fundamento, mas mostra a necessidade de pacificação jurisprudencial, e esse instrumento tem sido usado, tanto a súmula vinculante como vinculação das ações de controle concentrado, que é o modelo que o Brasil adotou de controlar a constitucionalidade legal, constitucionalidade das leis a partir de uma ação direta junto ao Supremo Tribunal Federal, né, e não a partir de controles de ações individuais e difusas. E essa sistemática tem sido muito implementada, muito significativa, até porque a Constituição também veio ampliar o universo de possíveis atores a propor essas ações. Governadores, entidades sociais em base nacional, entidades sindicais, entidades representativas em base nacional, todas essas, além da presidente, Procurador-Geral da República, etc. Né? Sendo que contra todos esses, só resta a mim que tem essa função, porque a Constituição me obriga assim, de defender a lei. Então eu sou, nesse caso, o único advogado da lei, enquanto os demais podem acusá-la publicamente. Essa é a função do advogado-geral, porque a Constituição também foi sábia. Já que não há no controle concentrado um litígio, não uma parte contra a outra, existe, na verdade, a necessidade de constituir um curador, um defensor dessa lei, que é um defensor público da lei. Nesse caso, essa competência foi atribuída a mim, no caso, ao meu posto, né, de advogado-geral da União. Então, nós temos aí uma universalidade de ações que vem aperfeiçoando a realidade institucional e, portanto, criando uma base consistente e permanente de respeito à lei em várias faixas de atividade, seja na faixa de investimento econômico, a garantia da estabilidade das ações e das decisões tomadas do ponto de vista de investimento, seja na dimensão social, com a incorporação de cada vez mais de parcelas da sociedade que estavam e permaneciam no estado de pobreza e de miséria absoluta. E uma das metas do governo foi eliminar essa miséria absoluta do Brasil, trazendo essa população para um universo de cidadania em que outros direitos possam ser, de fato, demandados, além da própria necessidade de comida, que é basicamente o que vive, né? Quem vive na miséria absoluta, ele só tem preocupação com um direito, que é comer. Então, a retirada da população de uma situação de miséria permite ela ser também pretendente à titularidade de outros direitos, saúde, educação, emprego e assim por diante. E esse movimento tem sido muito positivo e muito bem sucedido no Brasil. E, da mesma forma, na necessidade de aperfeiçoamento e de qualificação de Estado cada vez mais legitimado. E aí várias leis foram adotadas no Brasil nesse período, como a lei do Ficha Limpa, que garantiu e estabelece maior responsabilidade do parlamentar nos processos de investigação. Essa foi uma lei de iniciativa popular, né, que foi aprovada pelo Congresso e acabou sendo ela validada pela Suprema Corte Brasileira. Da mesma forma, a lei de conflito de interesse, adotada em 2013, que obriga os agentes públicos graduados a submeterem a quarentena e não prestarem serviços a empresas que tenham relação com o Estado. A Lei de Acesso à Informação, em 2011, que obriga a transparência plena do Estado. Só para estabelecer, hoje, todos os salários individuais dos servidores públicos e agentes políticos do Estado são divulgados na internet. Qualquer um pode saber meu salário, que passa a entrar na página da Controladoria Geral da União, que fica sabendo quanto recebe cada agente público, exatamente porque esse é um elemento de transparência que foi estabelecido. Da mesma forma, nós temos a lei de combate à anticorrupção, a lei de combate à corrupção, que vem dentro do Tratado de 2003, que o Brasil adotou em 2006, e é uma lei que tem uma importância significativa. E essa lei, sobre esse ponto em particular, inclusive, mostra o que ainda nós temos de desafios a vencer. Porque o que nós percebemos nessa implementação é que, de fato, nós temos uma multiplicidade de órgãos, né, que incidem sobre o mesmo evento, que é o combate à corrupção. Então, nós temos, por exemplo, pega o caso específico da Operação Lava Jato, que hoje é uma grande operação de investigação no âmbito da Petrobras. Nós temos o Ministério Público, que tem a responsabilidade da investigação criminal, mas também tem, e é o que a lei de corrupção trata, que é a parte civil da responsabilização, é a responsabilização objetiva da empresa, não perquire se a empresa tinha ou não culpa, né, em relação àquele evento, mas por ter um agente tendo praticado um ato de corrupção, a responsabilidade da ação desse agente é trazida à própria empresa. Nós temos a Controladoria Geral da União, que é o órgão de controle. Nós temos o Tribunal de Contas da União, que também tem incidência com base na legislação própria. Nós temos a própria Advocacia Geral da União, que tem a responsabilidade de ação judicial sobre a matéria. E nós temos o CAD, com o caso tratando de cartel, além da própria Petrobras, que é a agente vítima nesse processo. Então, essa multiplicidade de órgãos, eles exigem, para que a própria lei seja bem implementada, um grau de entendimento, de uniformidade de compreensão na sua aplicação. E esse é um problema que está presente, que eu chamo de problema jurisprudencial. A jurisprudência é o elemento de concretização da própria lei para fins de sua implementação. É na jurisprudência que, em última análise, elas são resolvidos os impasses que se estabelecem dentro do sistema judicial, quando a lei é introduzida, mas também nos fatos, em relação aos fatos que se submetem a ela. Esse processo, ele exige que dos agentes públicos, em particular, dos órgãos envolvidos, a conformação de uma jurisprudência seja capaz de produzir maior estabilidade no sistema. Eu já estou passando aqui meus 15 minutos, eu só vou então concluir aqui, passar um pouco adiante. Eu ia dar um apanhado aqui. Eu vou deixar a apresentação e, evidentemente, ela fica à disposição para... eu queria só comentar essas soluções aqui. O que me parece, nesse contexto, em relação àquelas 3 faixas, que são os elementos de estabilidade, mas também de instabilidade, quando elas não são resolvidas, são os processos de formatação. Hoje o Brasil vem, pelo menos na fase legislativa, o Congresso Nacional ele vem cada vez mais sendo demandado a assumir o seu papel central da democracia. Então, um caso, por exemplo, os vetos presidenciais. Esse foi um tema que renudou um grande debate na Suprema Corte, em que ela a Corte deliberou da obrigatoriedade do Congresso deliberar sobre os vetos presidenciais, papel que ele não exercia há pouco tempo. Então, até muito pouco tempo. Então, o que acontecia é que a Constituição previa um prazo de 30 dias de manifestação, o Congresso interpretava que essa prazo só começava a correr da leitura da mensagem presidencial comunicando o veto em plenário. Portanto, como não era lida a mensagem, não se apreciavam os vetos e ficava aquele, digamos assim, passivo, como de fato ainda existe, passivo de deliberação. E a Corte disse não. A comunicação não é ao plenário, a comunicação é ao Congresso. Portanto, a comunicação da presidente faz iniciar o prazo e obriga a manifestação do veto. O grande elemento dessa decisão, que eu achei extremamente positiva, é que ela traz para o centro do processo legislativo o Congresso e não deixa ao Executivo esse centro, porque o veto acaba sendo a decisão definitiva em relação à matéria. Ou seja, o Congresso é chamado a tomar o centro do processo legislativo. Da mesma forma, da edição das medidas provisórias. A Constituição previa a necessidade de uma comissão dos duas casas, Senado e Câmara, a deliberarem previamente, mediante parecer, da constitucionalidade dessas propostas de medida provisória. O Congresso não o fazia uma comissão formal, mas que não deliberava, e jogava a deliberação final para a relatoria do plenário. O Supremo veio exigir, não, essa comissão precisa emitir o seu parecer. Se não houver emissão do parecer, o processo legislativo está violado e, portanto, não há possibilidade de tramitação da medida provisória. Então, esta dinâmica, essa obrigatoriedade de observância do processo legislativo como um processo legal necessário que a nossa Suprema Corte vem impondo cada vez mais, vem, na verdade, a fortalecer o Congresso como instância deliberativa. Então, esse é um elemento central da nossa eu digo, democracia, que se torna e se consolida. É, cada vez mais, numa sociedade que rejeita o autoritarismo, rejeita os estados autoritários, as formações de governos autoritários, reconhece que a expressão central, por mais difícil, né, que seja, porque se no Brasil muitas vezes se diz que só existe um Congresso pior do que o atual, é o próximo. Então, é uma ideia negativa em relação à representação parlamentar. Mas é uma sensação que decorre muitas vezes da ausência do próprio Congresso. Eu acredito profundamente que no momento que o Congresso cada vez mais assume o seu papel, ele tende a ver-se reconhecido na própria sociedade, porque é a sociedade que o elegeu, né? Hoje passa um debate central no Brasil, que é a questão do distritão, ou distrital, ou voto coligação, mas o fato é que a reforma política hoje se torna cada vez mais um imperativo para resgatar a qualidade da representação dos nossos parlamentares. Eu diria que, além disso, no nível da alta litigiosidade que hoje se estabelece, nós temos, além dos instrumentos de deliberação mais ágeis que se busca com o novo Código de Processo Civil, e aqui um destaque, esse é o primeiro Código de Processo Civil que é aprovado numa realidade totalmente democrática. Nós tivemos o de 39, que é um Código de Processo Civil instituído no governo do Estado Novo, ou no fim do governo do Estado Novo. Nós temos o de 73, que é um código também instituído numa período ditatorial, e nós temos o código agora, que é instituído, esse sim, a partir de um debate democrático. Foi uma comissão instituída pelo Congresso Nacional, pelo presidente Sarney, à época o presidente do Senado. Essa comissão fez uma proposta, a proposta foi deliberada pela Casa, foi alterada pelo Senado, foi alterada pela Câmara, e depois confirmada de novo pelo Senado, o que resultou na nova proposta. E um dos elementos que compõem e que está presente em uma série de legislações é a adoção dos instrumentos extrajudiciais de solução de conflitos. Acordos, nós temos um projeto de lei em tramitação, que está uma comissão especial da Casa, que é a adoção do Tax Agreement, do Acordos de Transação Tributária, pacificação de conflitos. Pra vocês terem uma ideia, o Estado de São Paulo, o Tribunal de Justiça do Estado de São Paulo, hoje ele tramita na Tribunal de Justiça em torno de 20 e poucos milhões de ações judiciais. 14 milhões de ações são execuções fiscais, são cobranças tributárias. Mostra o nível de saturação que este procedimento gera. Então, nós temos essa discussão dessa mudança, esse aperfeiçoamento, que está em tramitação na Casa, a lei de arbitragem, que está submetida à sanção presidencial, já foi aprovada a atualização, e o grande aspecto da lei de arbitragem é, de fato, implantá-la no setor público, em todas as disputas com o setor público, que hoje é um dos grandes litigantes no Estado brasileiro, e a lei de mediação, que voltou hoje ao Senado para confirmação, e que deve ser, na expectativa de ser aprovada, que prevê também todo um capítulo da mediação com o setor público, que é, de novo, um grande agente de litigante. E a nova lei de processo civil, que eu destacaria apenas um elemento central, porque esse é um elemento que me parece essencial na formação jurisprudencial, que é o segundo campo de fixação, que é o início, que eu diria, de um stare decisis no Brasil. A lei, ela em diversos artigos, no artigo 489, 926, 998, vem a exigir do juiz o respeito aos precedentes. Vem exigir do juiz a necessidade de, havendo precedentes, ser possível, ser necessário que o juiz venha justificar primeiro se há ou não fato novo que justifica ou não observância daquele precedente, venha justificar ou não a necessidade de adoção. E a obrigação, que aliás é uma coisa curiosa, viu, professor Paulo, no Brasil, quando foi a sanção presidencial, uma das demandas dos juízes era que não fosse, que fosse vetado o artigo que existia a fundamentação da decisão. Toda decisão, qualquer que seja, ela tem que ser fundamentada. E os juízes exigiam, dizendo que iam ser saturados de trabalho. Evidentemente, esse dispositivo foi sancionado, mas mostra um pouco a lógica utilitária. A fundamentação de uma decisão obriga necessariamente que o juiz publicize aquilo que o levou a tomar a decisão e também dá à lógica, à sistemática precedente, muito mais força. Eu acho que o elemento precedente hoje é um elemento central. Eu já passei aqui muito do meu tempo. Eu agradeço a tolerância de todos por essa oportunidade e espero, se houver algum debate, estar à disposição para ele. Muito obrigado.
Now, we will continue now I don't have the program in front of me, but I believe that Oscar is next.
Can I speak from here? or-
Yes, sir, wherever you want to.
whatever you-
If
you're the
it's
boss.
comfortable from there, you're...
Okay. It's a free country, as you say. Well, thank you very much for this kind invitation. It is, Paulo Sotero is really a force of nature. When he first asked me about the possibility of organizing a meeting like that, I was a little bit skeptical, but in less than 2 months, he put everything together. So, Paulo, I thank you, and I praise your presence here as an energetic figure. And also Matthew and Luciana, who were those who academically organized this event. So I thank you both. Well, my role here is strange because after the talk of the minister and such a broad perspective of the challenges of the rule of law in Brazil, perhaps I don't have much to say. So I will try to keep a little bit with what I plan, but mixing with some reactions to what you said. And I think the first important thing to mention is how rule of law is mistaken or misleading concept. Why? If you go to the streets of Cairo or to the streets of Budapest in the 90s, of Buenos Aires in the end of 80s, people were reivindicating the rule of law. But also if you go to a meeting at the World Bank or the Walter Wilson Center in 2015, people will be talking about the rule of law. That's perhaps because the rule of law means different things for different people. People attached to some characteristics of the rule of law when they claim or when they praise the rule of law. It can be stability, it can be predictability for the market, but also can be rights, non-torture, for those who are on the streets. Obviously, I would say that besides this difference in this pushing around the concept, it is one of, to use a Marxist historian, an incommensurable human good. It's one of the cornerstones of the civilized process to be guided by law. So even though we can have some academic disputes, obviously we are in a consensus that this is a very important, and that's why I think the choice of Woodrow Wilson Center to take this as a main theme is it's a very important. The rule of law has two important dimensions, I think, when we try to understand how it is being implemented in a certain country. One is the institutional dimension. And basically, we are thinking about the government being bound by law. But also, there is another dimension that I think it's much more challenging to understand, which is the relational dimension of the rule of law. So how people act, how people behave regarding the law. People, when we say that a certain society lives under a rule of law, we are saying that people act in accordance to the law, and most of all, people expect that other people would behave in the same way. And that is the important thing. It's the expectation that we have, and because of this expectation, we decide to take actions in a more free way, in a more determined way, and this builds social trust. So my very short presentation here will try at the same time to say a little bit things about the institutional basis of the rule of law in Brazil. And no.
Okay, sir. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. So, and then close as a conclusion remarks a little bit with the relational dimension of the rule of law. So, as Ambassador said, we had an extremely important moment in Brazilian life that is perhaps the culmination of the transitional process, which was the constitutional process of 1997, 1998. Minister Jobim is here and probably could criticize most of my arguments, but I hope you will endorse some of them. What is the nature of this constitutional assembly process that we had? First of all, it was immensely inclusive. It was not a constitution on the Brazilian tradition done by jurists in a closed room. It was one of the perhaps the most democratic moments in the Brazilian life. We have here some of the pictures of this moment. It was very plural, so the most sectors, organized sectors of the Brazilian society were present there. We have a friend, Ministro Reale Jr., and I ask your translation here that would say, from da tanga a toga, all of them were there. Tanga is the... You should help me.
Well, from the beginning to the end.
Okay.
The start to the finish.
Okay, all of them were
The
there.
modest way to say it.
So it was an immense pressure from all the sectors of the Brazilian society. It was very fragmented, even though there was a blueprint of this constitutional on the Arinos Commission. This blueprint was formally disregarded, and most of the process was starting from the scratch. And finally, there was the conciliatory strategy of the Brazilian politics, the tradition of the Brazilian politics. So everything started from this man, who is Ulisses Guimarães, with a systematization with the thematic committees, and the thematic committees were broken in several sub-thematic committees. And that's how interests were collected in the Constitutional Assembly process. So it started with every group trying to influence one of the subcommittees, and then the committees, and then the systematization process. What was the result of this? And this is my point. it became a maximizing compromise. That is the nature of our Constitution. I always think of a phrase from Jefferson that wasn't here in the U.S. during the U.S. Constitutional Assembly, and he was very angry because the rights were not there. And he was trying to discuss this with Madison, and Madison explaining him why the rights were not there originally. And finally he understood, and he said, this is quoting him, "Oh, now I understand. It's everyone's second choice. We agreed on an instrument of government, and we left a lot of substantive decisions outside of the text." I would say the Brazilian Constitution is everyone's first choice. So all the substantive interests were entrenched in the Constitution. So this Constitution that is the opposite model of the U.S. Constitution was received with a very skeptical, in a very skeptical way. So most of the people would say that this Constitution, which is ubiquitous in the sense that it legislates about everything. Every major theme of the Brazilian society is included in the Constitution. That is very ambitious because it's a Constitution that not just reacts against the past of inequality and underdevelopment, but is a Constitution that aims to create a society that is very plural and is very equalitarian in some sense. And is and also a contradictory Constitution. If you read the text in detail, and that's the job that we do every day, you will find a lot of ambiguity on this Constitution. So the reaction from the jurists, from those who lost in the constitutional process, was very skeptical. And most people would say that this Constitution would not last for 30 years. And against all these expectations, so against all these expectations that this new kind of omnibus constitution that carries everything inside, and I would say that the Constitution really, in fact, has a core where the rights and the machinery of democracy, and then it has policies around it. And this new kind of constitution that people would say it would become old very soon, it would create a lot of social frustration because it would not be implemented, became a very resilient document. Or perhaps it created a very resilient political system. What does resilient means in this sense? It means that the Constitution was able to adapt, to reform itself, to face and overcome the challenges without breaking. So we stabilize our political system in a different way. So why the Brazilian Constitution, against all expectations, became a model of success? I think there are several explanations for that. First of all, we created a very consensual political system. In Brazil, there's no winner after an election. Even if you win the presidency, perhaps you will have a Congress that is very fragmented, and you will have a federal composition that will be not in alliance with the president. So it's very difficult to govern in Brazil because we have a very consensual system. People should be put together so we can create orientation in the political system. Second, we have a very independent judicial system with a very independent Ministério Público. However, the Supreme Court became a kind of moderator power in the Brazilian legal system. So it can modulate some of these conflicts that take over the relationship between Congress and presidency and the judiciary itself. The Constitution, although very ubiquitous in legislating about everything, normally transfer the detail the refinement of its normative desire and defer to Congress. So if we take this large document that can be a weapon against our enemies, you always will see that any of this, the rules here will end with a comma, and Congress will regulate that. So even though the Constitution is very ambitious, it transferred to Congress. People said that this was a problem, but this became the real channel for the vitality of democracy, because Congress will modulating the impact of the Constitution by regulating its dispositions. So this also became a strength of the democratic society. Fourth, it creates self-implementation mechanism. Most people said that this constitution would be only a facade constitution, a constitution that would not have impact over society. And in fact, several mechanisms were created. One kind of mechanism was budgetary mandatory allocations. So for the rights of health, for the rights of education, you have a mandatory budget allocation, which in 30 years made a velvet revolution in the Brazilian society. We start in 1988 with 78% of the children in school. We have today 99% of children in school. If you take all the indexes in terms of health, the improvement is fantastic. Does the Constitution made it? Not obviously. Much more factors were involved in this, but the Constitution was a great help for society to move from one point to another. Second, it creates Minister Sepúlveda Pertences, a notorious minister of the Supreme Court, used to say, when the Constitution was created, we have rights without subjects. We need to find those who were put these rights in place. So the Ministério Público is a kind of institution that has expanded its mandate and now had a key position in extracting content from the rights that were formally established in the Constitution. Finally, I think this resilience came from one point which is sometimes hard to explain. Minister Adams said something that for an American audience could be odd. The Supreme Court decided that one part of an amendment of the Constitution was unconstitutional. So the Brazilian Supreme Court can declare parts of amendments unconstitutional. Why is this? Because Brazil, after creating such an enormous constitution, created a very flexible way to reform the Constitution. That's why in 27 years we had more than 80 amendments to the constitutions. For some people, this is a sign that this is a weak constitution. For other people, this is a sign that there is a complete loyalty to the constitutional process. So everything that we want to change in the Brazilian society, we go to the constitutional debate, we do a constitutional amendment, and we agree, we create consensus and transform. So the Constitution is very flexible to be reformed, but require political and democratic consensus. However, it blocks some changes, and these changes are related to the protection of the rights, the protection of democracy, and the protection of separation of power. And that's how, although we changed the Constitution more than 80 times, we never touch any important clause related to rights, to democracy, or to the separation of powers. So this is what gave a lot of robustness to this constitutional enterprise. And loyalty. So there is a lot of loyalty to the constitutional system. So in conclusion, we create, I don't know how consciousness, and perhaps Minister Jobim could tell us about it, but we create a new model of constitutional design. There is a fantastic research done by a professor at Chicago called Tom Ginsburg. And surprisingly, the constitutions that rest more in history in the last century are those who are larger in terms of words. The American Constitution is an exception to the constitutions that were drafted in the last century. Why? What is the relation? Because normally larger constitutions are constitutions that include more interests. And constitutions that include more interests are backed by larger percentage of society and larger groups in society. So perhaps the Brazilian Constitution of 1998 is, as the Indian Constitution, as the South African Constitution, as the Colombian Constitution, a new model of constitutionalism that were results of reactive moments in this society, and that's why they receive such loyalty. So just to finalize, obviously that this new institutional enterprise had immense impact on the relationship of Brazilians with the law. I think the riots that Paulo mentioned some minutes ago, the 2013 riots promoted basically by students with a very progressive agenda in terms of rights to health, to education, to transportation, or the riots of 2015 that perhaps were backed by a more conservative middle class that were basically asking for more decency and honesty in government. Both of them are signs that people are invoking rights as the main grammar of their political discourse. And that means that Brazil perhaps is passing through a Tocquevillian revolution in terms of commitment to the notion of rights and to the notion of rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, I failed to say, because this is planned as a first exercise. We hope to, in 6 months or so, to be in São Paulo and continue this conversation. And Professor Ginsburg has committed, in principle, to join us there and to continue the dialogue. I would like to invite now Judge Peter Massetti to make his remarks. I'm very curious how he reacts to what we heard.
Well, my first reaction was that I've been on so many panels in Brazil. Usually I get invited to compose the front table, and then I begin with a series, or at least listen to a series of Sua Excelência Luiz Inácio Adams, Sua Excelência Embaixador, Nelson Jobim, assim por... It goes on and on. Here, we just jump right into it, and we start talking. But I do want to acknowledge the excellent presence of our people. And Paulo Sotero, Matthew Taylor, thank you for promoting this project, which I have really been involved with for about 40 years or so. I started back when, and I know there's only one person here, I think, who will remember back when, and that's Joaquim Falcão, who was a young man at the time when we got involved in dialogue called Law and Development. Joaquim, you remember that. I was on the fringe as a young lawyer, and I think Joaquim was a reasonably young lawyer in those days too. And there was an extensive dialogue with the Ford Foundation and the Agency for International Development. And really, I think the Getulio Vargas schools in many ways are the heirs of that of those projects. Not more to say about that now, but in any event, I'm very happy to be here, talk about a subject that is dear to my heart. First Brazil, and then the whole issue of judicial reform. Judicial reform is a topic of great interest around the world. I would like to offer the perspective of someone who's been involved in rule of law projects formerly known as law and development, and whatever you might have called it, which really goes back to the end of the Second World War. There have been a number of projects that have always been underway in Brazil, and I'll come back to this. It started certainly in the 1960s, but in the last 25 or 30 years, the idea of rule of law has really taken off. When the international lending organizations such as the World Bank and the Inter-American Bank and the other regional banks said, look, you have to have a substantially reliable legal and judicial system, or you won't get investment and you won't develop economically. That really was the initial motivation of a lot of the judicial reform projects around the world. And then some very thoughtful people, including many in Brazil, said, and you know what else? Rule of law means democracy. It's not just a byproduct of economic development. It's important. But that's really what motivates us. So it really is a combination of both. And I might say, some of you remember that just last month at Washington College of Law, we had a program on legal protection of foreign investment in Brazil. I mean, who's going to come? Who's going to stay unless there's a solid legal system to depend upon? So that continues. Today, though, we talk as well about democracy and rule of law. This is a very topical matter, as I say, not just in Brazil. Conferences have proliferated on rule of law in every part of the globe. But let me remind you, here's a statement that I heard a Queen's Counsel from the UK, Sir Geoffrey Robinson, say a few years back. The fundamental principles which guide legal and judicial reform in every country are to be found in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, notably Article 7, protection against discrimination. Article 8, the right to an effective legal remedy. Article 9, the rule against arbitrariness. Article 10, the right to a fair and public hearing by an independent tribunal. And Article 11, the presumption of innocence, expanded in terms of defense of rights by Article 14 of the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And these are principles that really have been out there for quite some time. So it's not really a new phenomenon, but it has accelerated in recent years. And certainly, one of the great impetuses around the world came with the demise of the Soviet Union, when all the countries in Central and Eastern Europe that had been effectively part of the communist system needed to set up new governments. They really needed to create from scratch judicial systems. And there was a lot of international dialogue that we attended. I remember being at a World Bank conference maybe 15 or so years ago, and there was a statement that was made by the Chief Justice of the Russians, then the former Russian state of Georgia. And he said, with the help of our friends in the World Bank, the United States, and throughout Europe, each day brings Georgia closer to its goal of a modern professional court system that is the foundation of a society based on rule of law. This is the dream of every judge in Georgia and each of our citizens. And of course, you could repeat that mantra in various parts of the world, whether it's Mozambique or Tanzania, Zambia, Cambodia, now Cuba it may be. We'll see what happens in the next few years with Cuba. These are all countries that the World Bank, with the exception of Cuba, the World Bank has been involved with Cuba too, but the World Bank has created incentives for judicial reform in many of these countries, as has the Inter-American Bank. And it's true in other countries such as Ukraine and Somalia, Egypt, and South Africa. It has been recognized in these countries, but often with the outside influence of a World Bank, that the judicial machinery, if it exists at all, has not functioned very well. There's been a lack of independence of the judiciaries in these countries. Justice has been seen as slow and expensive. Laws have been archaic. There may be corruption. Justice simply has not been effective in many of these countries. And to be sure, I mean, Brazil has shared the experience of many of the countries I've mentioned. One listens to the critics today that justice in Brazil, despite all the remarkable and commendable innovations, continues to be costly, too slow. There are inefficiencies, and sometimes there's corruption. Those are all issues that are out there, as there are in many systems. But what's significant about Brazil, and here I think I can speak with some authority because as they say, I've been around. Brazil on its own, and for many years, has been extensively involved in judicial reform. It didn't take the World Bank to come to Brazil and say, hey, do this. It didn't take outside influences. In Brazil, there were thoughtful people, and they go way back, but my experiences with people like Carlos Veloso, even Ellen Gracie when she was a young judge. People, and before that, people started talking a long time ago about the need for judicial reform, what they would call agilização da justiça, including whatever, and all the issues that we're confronting now. I mean, they've been out there for a while, for quite some time. And as I say, the commendable part of Brazil is that Brazil has largely done it on its own. Yes, looking outside The great virtue of Brazil is that it's eclectic. You know, for all the problems that the United States may have had with Brazil over the years, never has been true between the judiciaries. Never has been true on the legal systems. There's always been a lot of dialogue about what works. And that goes back to the whole concept of things like the institution of the jury to a certain extent in Brazil, which is not common to the civil law system. There are other aspects of the composition of the courts and so on that very closely track some of the Anglo-American, Anglo-Saxon traditions that one finds in Brazil today. So Brazil has always had that virtue, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So if I were writing a report card, a boletim de notas, if you will permit me, I would give Brazil good marks on the issue of coming to terms with the problems that are presented by deficient judiciaries and trying to overcome them. But you know, as long as I'm giving a report card, I would have to say that in school, as in life, as in work, there's always room to be better. And perhaps I will suggest that we can look very closely at some of the institutions that have been undertaken in Brazil and see where we are. I would agree. I think Professor Vilhena has put his finger on it. We do have some differing views of exactly what rule of law means, but I would say we could much get a consensus on the following ideas. We're talking about judicial independence. We're talking about access to justice. We're talking about transparency of proceedings. We're talking about judicial efficiency and agility. We're talking about fair and reasonable decision making. We're talking about the enforceability of decisions. And hopefully we're talking about public respect for court, judges, justice, law, and so on. These are challenges. And let me just start with kind of a general observation about where Brazil is in all of this and how it's a self-starter, so to speak. I'm not sure that I can find in other parts of the world a governmental agency called the Secretariat for Judicial Reform, which happens to exist in Brazil, in the Ministry of Justice. That's what these guys do. They look at the issue of judicial reform all the time. We don't have that in the United States. There isn't a single governmental entity in the United States that thinks about judicial reform. We may get an idea from the American Bar Association or another lawyers group or some judges groups, but a central agency that thinks about these issues all the time, that's what I mean about Brazil looking at the issue in a self-starting way. And let's talk about the National Council of Justice, which of course is under fire right now, and I'll have a word to say about that. But this idea of the National Council of Justice, which not all of you perhaps are familiar with, but as part of the constitutional amendment of 2004, there was created a National Council of Justice with 15 members, some lay, some judges from various parts of the country, and they really make a lot of policy for the judiciary, including disciplining judges, which is very controversial. But look what you have there. You've got this national organization which is coming to terms with aspects that had been impediments to the rule of law. If you have corrupt judges or you have judges who are not productive, that's an impediment to rule of law because you do not have efficient justice. That's what Brazil has done, and that kind of overarching creation really is quite commendable, which is why I would say that there are high marks that are due for the general position of Brazil. But let me just pose a couple of things and I'll come back to them quickly. The Secretary for Judicial Reform in Brazil, Flavio Corochicatano, has been speaking around the country, and he says, look, there are at least 3 aspects of reform here that are necessary. Number 1, justice is still slow. Morosidade, he says. Number 2, too many processes. Excesso de processos. And third, access to justice is a serious problem. And I'm sure you'll hear from Professor Sadek a little bit about access to justice. Good ideas. We have some problems. And I'm now, if you will permit me, going to go through some issues, all the nice things that have been said, which are out there, and perhaps peel away a few layers and tell you how I've observed things, which is really part of the dialogue that I think we ought to have today and we ought to have in future as we go through this. I've sort of looked at this in terms of just how the legal process works. And let me talk about, for example, judicial independence, where I would give Brazil today rather high marks. I think Brazil has shown itself. You go back to the what we call in English the big monthly scandal, the Mensalão. That was a judiciary that was taking a position, a firm position. I was particularly impressed by the fact that the president of the Supreme Federal Tribunal, Joaquim Barbosa, whatever you might say about him, during Carnival, there were a lot of people wearing a mask for Joaquim Barbosa, which shows you that at least there was some public enthusiasm about it. Minister Jobim, I'm sorry that during your time there weren't people in Carnival wearing a mask with your face on, but perhaps in future you'll be remembered for what you've done. The other, but you look at issues like judicial independence, but there are aspects. You want to look, well, how are the courts organized? Is that working all right? How are the specialized courts working now? And you've got courts, small claims courts, another interesting innovation. In Brazil, to find out about the claims that Indians have for Social Security, there are boats that go up the Amazon. Am I correct? Think about that. It's a mobile court with a judge and a clerk, and they take claims through that. Who's doing that anywhere? I mean, that's an impressive innovation. That's Brazil reaching out. That may be working, but maybe the small claims courts are victims of their own success. Too many people. Can't handle them all. It's a problem. What do you do next? And I know there are courts that have been specialized courts that have been set up. There is a courts for money laundering. There are business courts. There are courts for intellectual property now that are pilot projects. Interesting innovations. And why do you do that? You do that because when you get judges who can develop expertise in a certain area, the cases move faster. They know what they're doing. And that's another sort of step forward, if you will, that's out there, which Brazil does interestingly. There are courts now, of course, that look at financial crimes, another aspect. And I think those are the kinds of things we ought to look at, because what Brazil is doing may be good or bad, and may be so good that it ought to be a model for other countries in development. I mean, that's part of what a true dialogue, it seems to me. We should be looking at issues like court facilities. Are they adequate? Well, they look good at the Supreme Federal Tribunal. They look good at the Superior Tribunal of Justice. I'm not sure how they look in Acre and other parts of the rural Brazil. In fact, the facilities, according to many, are quite weak in some of these areas, and perhaps court facilities need to be looked at. And of course, the effects of the recent amendments to the Code of Civil Procedure are going to be very important in terms of making more agile justice. And let's look at judges. Do we have enough judges in Brazil? Too many? Too few? How are they selected? Are the criteria working? Is the training working well? And I would say the training is working well in Brazil. That's a very strong suit as far as Brazil is concerned. How productive are judges? How are they evaluated? How are they promoted? How are they disciplined? Now that's where the debate is with the National Council of Justice right now. And many would say there's a strong effort on the part particularly of the state Supreme Courts to move away the central disciplinary authority of the National Council of Justice back to the state courts, which in my view, outsider, would be very weakening. But there are other people who may take another view, but that's something we need to look at and think about. What about judicial ethics? What about judicial corruption? Those are all issues that I think always need to be looked at. What about nepotism? Now, you know, there's a law against nepotism. Judges used to hire relatives to be right in their courts. You know what happens now? Many judges say to their colleagues, you hire my nephew and I'll hire yours. Cross nepotism. What about that? That's the kind of thing where one needs to look closely. Yeah, the nepotism, anti-nepotism law is out there, but is it being circumvented? Are there other ways to look at it? Are judges free from external justice? I was recently in a conference about Cuban justice with some judges, and it still is a telephone call from the party to get you to determine what your outcome is. I don't think we have that in Brazil today. That's part of the idea of justice. Are judges following the law? Here's a big item. We have an alternative justice movement in Brazil, particularly under the new civil code, particularly when consumer law is involved. The judges don't necessarily follow the contract. In Anglo-American law, the concept is pacta sunt servanda. The contract must be obtained. Well, under the new provisions, a judge could set aside a consumer contract as being inappropriate, not meeting the social goals. That makes foreign investors nervous. We need to talk. That's one of the things that we need to look at closely. Another thing I would say is, what about what in Brazil they call the valorização do juiz da primeira instância? Why aren't we using judges? I happen to be a judge of first instance, so I have a vested interest in saying this. But why aren't decisions of judges of first instance given more effect? And they will be, I think, now, with the idea that the jurisprudencia, the case law of the higher courts, must be followed. More cases should be disposed of in first instance. But that's another issue that's looked at that we ought to talk about. How are first instance court judges used? Or are we simply replicating their decisions again and again at every level of appeals? And of course, when we talk about access to justice, is it really, we have enough public defenders everywhere? Are they doing everything they should do? Are the small claims courts overloaded? No, here's the big, seems to me, A+ for Brazil. Conciliation, mediation, arbitration. Brazil really has embraced that concept fully. And there's a school, national school of mediation. There are all sorts of pedagogical materials. I don't know how many conferences, minister they've had on mediation, conciliation, but they're out there and they're doing that. And why? Because you can't do it all within the court system. You just can't. Flavio Croce Catano says there are 100 million cases out there, and the average time to decide them is 10 years. Now think about that. For every 2 Brazilians, you've got 1 case. That's a lot of cases. So the laws are out there working at it, but there are challenges. Transparency issues, delays, of course, I've talked about. Here's another issue of interest that I've talked about much, and some of you have. Plea bargaining, delação premiada, transação penal. These ideas of trying to unclog the criminal justice system by disposing them outside the system. Interesting dialogue. And of course, in the issues that are being confronted now, particularly in the Mensalão scandal, delação premiada was used. Delação premiada is being used now, as I understand it, in connection with the Petrobras investigation. So those are interesting issues. But do we have too many levels of appeal in Brazil? I wonder. Is there too much in terms of interlocutory appeals? Are they limited now by the new code? Should there be fewer appeals? Should there be bonds posted to create disincentives for appeals? Now, another 2 great innovations of the 2004 amendment, constitutional amendment to 2045, was the adoption of binding precedent, súmula vinculante, and discretionary review, which in Brazil they call repercussão geral, or general repercussion, which is very much like our certiorari in our court, where only cases of significant national interest are have to be taken up by the Supreme Court. But let's look at súmula vinculante, binding precedent. Great idea, apparently very bureaucratic, very cumbersome. I read a piece by President Lewandowski of the Supreme Federal Tribunal. He says too many people have to sign off for us to adopt the súmula vinculante. So whereas we should be adopting more decisions to basically decongest our courts, we're hesitant to do it because so many people are involved. There may need to be, another interesting point of discussion, a way in which to facilitate that, to make it more agile than it is now, another interesting topic. To what extent are judges responsible for delays? Are judges productive? Are they really following the timelines to get their cases out in time? Another interesting issue. What about equal justice under law, rich versus poor, powerful versus less powerful? What about the impunity of public officials, impunidade? Well, we're seeing some changes there now, but that has been an historic challenge that we have seen in Brazil. And of course, this whole idea of the alternative justice movement, Movimento Sem Terra, all these things. Is that rule of law? What is that exactly? How does that fit into rule of law? These are all challenges. Enforceable decisions. Again, I've looked at, for example, at the issue of statutes of limitations in criminal cases. As I understand the system, if you don't get a decision, a final decision within the statute of limitations, a criminal case can be dismissed. Isn't what we do here. If you start the case within limitations, it can take forever, but you do get a decision. Does that create an incentive for a defendant to make a case go on forever? Because the longer you can delay, the closer comes the statute of limitations and the dismissal of the case. Another area worth studying. Are there too many people in custody right now? My statistics, as I saw it from a UN report, was 550,000 people in custody. In Brazil, 40% of whom are there pre-trial. preventive detention. And yet there was a law passed 2 years ago that said preventive detention should be the last resort. Eduardo Suarez of the Library of Congress just told me that Minister Barroso dismissed a case of a fellow who had been detained for a minimum amount of possession of drugs because he said, why are we doing this in effect? Which is what he should say, in my view. Those are the kinds of things and judges are responsible for these kinds of decisions. Judges are responsible for keeping the prison system working. Well, I could go on. And then, of course, the whole idea of alternatives to incarceration, community service programs, and so on that can be used in lesser crimes. Finally, I guess the idea would be with respect to creating respect for the court system. I just want to make one final comment, Paulo, if I may, and then pass on this. There are a number of issues that will come up along the way today and hopefully over the next sessions that we'll have over the next 2 years. I see this, when we talk about judicial reform, as essentially talking about the actors in the judicial system, the judges, the court personnel, the lawyers, and not so much the substantive laws, which anti-corruption laws, for example, are decisions that are made by the Congress that are applied by the courts. But I think we will concern ourselves as we get into these discussions with whether the fundamental rights and guarantees under the Constitution of '88 are being adequately protected. There are debates out there now about what the age for criminal responsibility ought to be. Should it be, is it 16, 18, whatever the ages are? What about crimes against women? What about the conditions of prisons? What about police abuse? What about police torture? Is it easy or difficult to do business in Brazil today? Brazil did not get a particularly high rating from the World Bank on that recently, another issue worth considering. So laws protecting foreign investors and so on. Well, that's really all that I have to say today, and I hope that I have agitated a few in what I have said, because I've meant to point out that notwithstanding the nice things, the good things, the commendable things that have been done in Brazil, there's still a lot to be done, and the best thing is the Brazilians know it, and so we would like to be part of the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So having heard from the public official, from the executive, from the judge, from the professor, we'll hear now from the representative of the lawyer from the private sector that is dealing with all of this reality. I believe that, Ambassador, that you have to, you can stay, you can, okay. Yes, and so, Glaucia, please, the floor is yours.
Well, I know that our time is short, but I would like to enjoy my time to make a question to Minister Adams, because I think that we have very important issues to debate. Minister Adams, I will make the question in Portuguese, maybe. Eu entendo que existem dois fatos muito importantes e bem atuais acontecendo no Brasil. Acho que um diz respeito ao fato das questões jurídicas e judiciais, elas estarem nas capas dos jornais, nas revistas semanais. O cidadão comum, hoje, ele debate as questões judiciais de uma maneira muito natural. Por outro lado, nós temos uma demanda por serviços públicos, como talvez nunca tenha existido no país. Claro que esses serviços públicos estão mais concentrados na área de transporte, de educação, de saúde. Se a gente conjugar aí esses dois fatos, a minha questão que eu coloco, e gostaria de ouvir a sua opinião, é o seguinte: será que nós estamos tendo também, ou que teremos num futuro próximo, uma demanda por melhores serviços públicos na área legal? E aí, obviamente, que eu envolvo tanto o judiciário como o próprio legislativo, que é responsável pela execução da lei. Será que esta demanda que a gente vê nas ruas, que vem do cidadão comum, vai alcançar esses serviços jurídicos e judiciais?
É curioso essa pergunta, porque ela me evocou agora um exemplo que eu queria registrar, porque a população brasileira, e essa regra de inclusão que o professor Oscar falou é muito significativa, porque ela, de fato, envolve o judiciário também. Envolve o judiciário em variedade de temas, por exemplo, precatórios, processos temáticos de pagamento
Sim.
pelo Estado. O judiciário está no centro desse debate. Quando houve o processo mensalão, alto nível de transparência das deliberações da Corte, que se dá via dever justiça. Não conheço nenhuma corte no mundo que tenha esse tipo de transparência, fez com que houvesse um fato curioso que, durante os debates e os votos, várias redes de televisão contratassem comentaristas, advogados, comentando cada voto como se fosse um jogo de futebol, em que cada momento era um momento eletrizante e de reflexão, por algo que quem vive o dia a dia da Corte acha que, convenhamos, é muito chato, né? Mas o fato mostra o tipo de envolvimento. Eu me lembro que na discussão da ficha limpa, a minha filha de 15 anos, à época, tinha uma rede de discussão pela internet e eles ficavam eu fiquei sabendo porque eu entrei no quarto dela e ela estava na rede conversando sobre os votos dos ministros durante o debate ficha limpa. Ela é minha heroína, né? Ministra Ellen Grace é minha heroína, e fulano, quer dizer, fazendo comentários sobre isso. Isso me coloca um tema que é interessante, que é o judiciário hoje está no centro da atenção da população em geral. Então, esse é um elemento que, meu ponto de vista, reforça, evidente, um pouco a pressão do judiciário, mas reforça também uma qualidade que eu acho que o judiciário fez e tem feito de autorreformar-se. Então, só apontando alguns temas que o nosso juiz Peter Messi falou, exemplo, o sistema de carceragem. Ele foi um objeto pelo Conselho Nacional de Justiça dos chamados mutirões carcerários, que localizaram verdadeiros absurdos, para nossa vergonha, mas que são importantes porque eles foram localizados e são objetos de reforma, como, por exemplo, prisão preventiva. O mutirão carcerário encontrou um rapaz no Nordeste que estava preso há 14 anos preventivamente. Eu não imagino o que possa exigir esse nível de prisão preventiva. Mas isso aconteceu muito. Então, isso é toda uma agenda do judiciário. Metas dos juízes. Todo ano, os juízes são submetidos pelo Conselho Nacional de Justiça a atender metas de julgamento, metas de resolução de litígios. Isso é uma agenda que cada juiz tem que apresentar ao Conselho Nacional de Justiça. Tudo isso é o porquê? Porque há uma pressão, há uma percepção da sociedade que o judiciário é uma solução, mas também é um problema, se não atender. A demora processual é um tema recorrente, que leva a todos os sistemas alternativos de mediação, arbitragem, transação, principalmente com o Estado brasileiro. Nós estamos discutindo a reforma da lei de cobrança do crédito público, e um dos elementos da reforma, que hoje não existe, é que só se pode entrar com a ação se houver já identificado bens para cobrança. Quer dizer, se não há patrimônio a ser cobrado, não há por que ajuizar a ação. E hoje é ajuizada. O que vem é saturar o judiciário. Então, eu acho que o tema não diria nem que é para o futuro, já existe hoje. Eu acho que existe hoje. Não no nível de reivindicação, porque não está submetido ao poder político, como o executivo ou o legislativo, mas o judiciário hoje ele é objeto de atenção, objeto de envolvimento, e que tem, inclusive, alterado a própria sistemática de escolha das polícias supremadas. Alterado nesse sentido. O próprio Congresso, o próprio Senado, assume cada vez mais um papel mais preocupado, mais atento às escolhas que são feitas para a Suprema Corte. Foi um caso do agora ministro, né, futuro ministro Fachin, submetido a eu sei que nos Estados Unidos é comum, mas lá é uma diferença, porque normalmente esses eventos eram protocolares. E eles deixaram de ser protocolares. Isso é uma diferença importante. A seleção dos ministros para a Corte deixou de ser um evento protocolar de elogios e passou a ser um evento de sabatina, cada vez mais. Tanto que eles passou 12 horas seguidas sendo sabatinado. Ele saiu depois da meia-noite, o Senado se reuniu com a presença massiva dos parlamentares, questionando cada aspecto do indicado. E isso mostra o reforço do poder legislativo no papel, que é importantíssimo, mas também força o cuidado com as escolhas que estão sendo feitas. E apesar de toda a controvérsia política que se gerou em torno da indicação, o Senado, afinal, foi reverente na escolha porque percebeu que ela atendia os requisitos, as qualidades que ele esperava e acabou aprovando, eu diria até com uma boa maioria, né? Se esperava uma variação de mínimo de 2, 3 votos e teve mais 53 votos favoráveis à indicação, o que mostra que o Congresso soube exercer o seu papel de maneira adequada. Mas é isso que eu acho que estabelece. No Brasil hoje, o Poder Judiciário adquire um papel proeminente. Eu não gosto da expressão poder moderador, porque poder moderador na nossa Constituição tem um significado originário do Império de ser um poder superior e que supervisiona os demais. Eu acho que o Judiciário é um poder, digamos assim, de mediação da disputa entre os dois poderes. E eles próprios, hoje, é submetido a essa disputa, porque o próprio Congresso também reage cada vez mais ao que se considera, no chamado ativismo judicial, uma certa usurpação das escolhas, que são, de fato, escolhas que a Constituição atribuiu ao Congresso, mas que muitas vezes, pela demora de deliberação, faz com que o próprio Judiciário queira resolver isso imediatamente.
Só uma notinha de rodapé no poder moderador, eu acho que você tem toda a razão. Tem um cientista político importante para essa casa, que é o Alfred Stephan, que dizia que no Brasil os militares ocuparam o poder moderador durante a República. E o que me parece é que a partir de 1988, neste sentido de um poder que evita as crises, o Supremo passou a ocupá-lo. Então é um significado positivo e não no sentido imperial.
We have time to a second question. I would like to formulate a question to Professor Oscar. I remember that I was in a discussion about BTT, bilateral tax treaty, with American colleagues here in US, and we pointed many issues that should be amended. And when I said, well, in this question, we need to amend our Constitution, in this point, we need to amend our Constitution, the colleagues said, well, it's impossible to have a BTT because are you going to amend your Constitution? And I said, well, in Brazil, it's very common. Oh my God, it's common, but it's good. It's my opinion, at least.
Thank God.
My question to Professor Oscar was in this way. Do you think that is there a limit to the Constitution be amended? I'm not talking about the clausulas pétreas, but in your opinion, the Constitution must be really flexible in Brazil?
That's a philosophical question
Very
that I probably will
philosophical.
not be able
Very
to
philosophical.
answer. Well, you have countries that do not have a rigid constitution as England. You have countries that have different kinds of rigidity in their constitution. It is interesting that Brazil had a tradition to have necessary two-thirds majority to change the constitution. And the 1988 constitution, in the end, as I know, and also indulge for your if I'm wrong, but in the end there was a decision, let's make it a little more flexible and make 3/5, which is 60%. So if you have 60% of both houses, you can amend the Constitution. The Constitution is very ambitious. It has create norms about everything. So obviously, this Constitution will face moments where the decisions taken in the past are not the most appropriate to face the challenges of the future. So what we are seeing is that instead of being disrupted, instead of being just thrown away, Brazil decided to put all these challenges on the table and discuss and create a higher level of consensus to overcome these problems. So we have all the privatization reforms that change completely the economic system. You have all the administrative reforms that make our administration much more meritocratic and under control. We made all the reforms on the judicial system, which was of amazing importance. So I think this creates a new environment in Brazil where we see the challenges as challenges that are not blocked by past constitutional decisions, but that could be overcome by a constitutional consensus. And it's working very well, I would say, because it stabilized the system, create a lot of loyalty, and at the same time, the necessary flexibility. The notion that we have the clausulas pétreas, or these untouchable constitutional clauses, also serves as an anchor of what could not be touched. So I would say Brazil has a constitution inside of the constitution. So we have a super constitutional clauses that organize democracy and rights, and we have policy clauses that organize the day-to-day politics. It was a good decision or not to put in the constitution? In the end, it has been proven okay.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I don't know if there are other observations. We are just, if we break now and we come back here in about 12, 13 minutes, we will be only 15 minutes late, which is a miracle. So I would propose that first we applaud this excellent presentation, then that you go out very quickly for coffee and refreshments and be back here at exactly 11:30, because then we will catch up. Thank you very much. Vamos transcrever tudo.
Hard rock. Oh.